I don't know, we're just living through mayhem in society with women's rights, gay rights, and God knows what to change the basic nature of humans. And yet, all over the world, primitive societies and through evolution, we've seen polygamy as normal. You still see it in tribal scenarios. And it's often a case of just taking care of a widowed woman so that she's not alone. I mean, there's often a social aspect to this. Are you familiar with the
Right.
issue of polygamy?
Yes, yes, I am. Yes, it's when you raise the issue of widowed women, it raises the question of why we tend to have a disproportionate number of widows. Why do men die more than women? And you have to look at the roles that historically and even today men are expected to play. I mean, men are the soldiers. Men work in heavy industry and in labor. 99% of workplace fatalities are men. They die on average 7 years or 6 years before women do. They have almost double infant mortality rate, which is interesting. Is that something like 53 or 54% of all people born are men, are boys. But as you go by the age of 15 or 20, that number has almost reversed. And so maybe there's a way that we've historically treated men. You mentioned feminism, and you mentioned some of these social issues. And what's so strange is that they're presented as something revolutionary. It's certainly very different from the way traditional societies were shaped. But there's also a strong similarity, which is something that people don't always think about, Morris, which is that something that traditional societies, and I'm not saying anything bad about traditional societies, but something that feminism has in common with traditional societies is the idea that men are disposable. Now, I think polygamy, there's nothing morally wrong with it. In my view, it's a product of certain necessity that have arisen because of the roles that men have had to play. It would seem
So, was it prevalent in the Christian world in past
it was
times?
prevalent. It was prevalent in the Christian world. Keep in mind that Christianity began as a Oriental or Near Eastern religion. It was much bigger in places like the Levant and Armenia and Iran before it was big at all in places like France and Germany. That came much later in time. And it wasn't until the 4th century which was only 15 or 1600 years ago, that Christianity became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. But even then, it wasn't the dominant religion among people of the Roman Empire. But there is a stabilizing effect to polygamy, but there can also be a destabilizing effect to polygamy. If you have a shortage of men, it certainly has to do with the rights of women that polygamy would exist. But if you've had a time of relative peace, or there hasn't been famine, or you haven't had the types of labor that have resulted in a high rate of male death, and what I'm saying is, if you have a situation where roughly half the people are men, then polygamy can lead to destabilization, because you'll have some men with several wives and other men with no wives. And naturally, those men's needs and reproductive, sexual, social, and so forth, their needs will be unfulfilled. My sense, and this is a view shared by others, I'm not a historian in this area, but my understanding is that in Western Europe, because you had higher rate of rainfall and you had decentralized economies, that you didn't have permanent standing armies where boys were conscripted, but in what are called hydraulic societies, for example, in Egypt or in Assyria or in the Near East, where rainfall was less prevalent, and where for farming to take place, you would the government, the central government, had a more important role to play in the distribution of water. They were then able to regulate more closely the growing of agriculture, which allowed them to maintain standing armies. And so when you had a large proportion of men serving in the standing army, then you had a large number of women who didn't have husbands, and that created a situation where you could have polygamy. So the difference is that, yes, in early Christianity, polygamy was a norm. There are some biblical scholars who try to say that it wasn't, because they say that a priest should not have more than one wife. But as we know, the roles of priests and the roles of laymen are very distinct and they're different. So it seems to have always been a practice that a priest could only have one wife, but that in Eastern Christianity that it was possible to have multiple wives. And it was only later, when Christianity became more of a Western religion and a European religion, that we saw the introduction of monogamy as a norm.
I see. I wouldn't be surprised if it does exist within the Middle East, in Muslim countries where the polygamy is more accepted. But just one additional statistic that you didn't mention for the lack of males in society is the amount that are in prison, far more than women. So there's a lot of missing men as well.
Right. There's prison. Right. I didn't mention that. And by and large, the prison populations are male.
Yeah.
So absolutely. One of the things in the U.S. that is a bigger problem now is that it has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and being a large country with 350 million people, when you have 1 or 2% of people in prison, and you've got millions of people in prison. Which is strange, though, is that women in the United States are carrying forward on the social expectations from men that existed 50 years ago when the U.S. was having its post-war economic boom. But today, where you have high rates of unemployment and low prospects for careers and opportunities, the expectations of women haven't changed. And so this has led to a lot of tension or friction between the genders. And this doesn't seem like there's a resolution for it. The feminist lobby is still saying the same things that it's said for the last 40 or 50 years, but the conditions have really changed. Men can't do the things that they were expected to do in the past while handing over some of the best opportunities to women.
It's just all newfangled ideas, that this modern society, we've in other videos discussed those in power, and you can be rather sure they're following very traditional modes and very unlikely to be fighting for feminism for themselves.
For themselves. That's interesting you raised that. I think that's the critical point that really doesn't get discussed, is that the people in charge in no way take their own medicine. No. And what they're prescribing for others, it almost seems like, I would venture to say that they're doing this to perpetuate their own rule. I think it's fairly well established that their methods of family organization are successful, and that if other people practice those same methods, they'd be much harder to rule over.
I couldn't agree more with you.